"Don't worry, it's just wine, it'll wash off," the young man said with a smirk, tilting his glass just enough for the deep red liquid to spill across Ethan Cole Carter's chest, staining the crisp white fabric like a deliberate signature, and for a moment, time didn't react, it hesitated, as if the entire room needed to decide whether this was a joke or a declaration, and then came the laughter, light at first, then louder, sharper, echoing through the private investment gala like permission. Granted, because in a room built on money, status, and silent hierarchies, people didn't laugh at what was funny, they laughed at what felt safe, and right now, humiliating a man who didn't look the part, felt very safe. Ethan didn't move, not immediately, not even to wipe the wine from his chest, he simply looked down at it, watching the liquid spread slowly, deliberately, like it had all the time in the world, like it belonged there, and then he lifted his gaze, calm, steady, unreadable, the kind of stillness that didn't match the chaos around him, the kind that made a few people shift uncomfortably without knowing why, but the young man, Daniel Whitmore, heir to one of the largest private equity families in the room, didn't notice, or didn't care. He raised his glass again, swirling what remained with careless amusement. "Wrong place, man," he added, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, and they did. A few chuckled again. Others glanced away, choosing silence over confrontation. Because silence was always the cheaper option. Across the marble floor, under chandeliers worth more than most homes, the message was clear without ever being said outright: you don't belong here, not dressed like that, not standing like that, not breathing in a space built for people who looked nothing like you. And still, Ethan said nothing, his posture unchanged, his hands relaxed at his sides, as if the moment hadn't reached him yet, as if he were observing it from somewhere slightly removed. And that quiet did something strange to the room. It stretched the tension instead of breaking it, it made the laughter feel thinner, less certain. But Daniel wasn't finished, not with his audience watching, not with his parents just a few feet away, observing with mild curiosity rather than concern, because to them, this wasn't a problem, it was a performance, and their son was simply playing his role. Daniel leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to sound personal but still loud enough to carry. "Seriously, man, you lost," he said, and this time, the words landed heavier than the wine, not because of their volume, but because of their intent. And somewhere near the edge of the crowd, a woman shifted, her brows tightening, sensing the line that had already been crossed, but no one stepped forward, no one interrupted, because the room had already chosen its side, and in that choice, Ethan Cole Carter stood alone, a man in a stained shirt, surrounded by tailored suits and polished smiles, yet somehow, impossibly, he looked like the only one not trying to prove anything at all. Daniel Whitmore straightened his cuff as if the moment had already passed, as if what he had done required no consequence, his confidence fed by the quiet approval that lingered in the room. But Ethan Cole Carter still had not moved, and that was what began to unsettle people, not the stain, not the insult, but the absence of reaction, because in a space like this, reactions were currency: outrage, embarrassment, apology. They all had value, but silence was unpredictable, and unpredictability made people uncomfortable. Ethan slowly reached up, not to wipe the wine away, but to adjust the collar of his shirt, a small, precise movement that felt out of place against the weight of what had just happened, his fingers steady, his expression unchanged, as if he refused to let the moment define him, as if he had already decided it was beneath him. And that quiet decision began to ripple outward, a subtle shift in the air that even those who had laughed could not ignore. Across from him, Daniel let out a short breath, half amused, half impatient. "You are just going to stand there?" he asked, tilting his head slightly, searching for a reaction he could use, something to push against. But Ethan's eyes met his, calm and level, not defensive, not angry, just present, and that presence carried a weight Daniel had not expected, a weight that did not match the clothes, the posture, the story he had already written in his mind. Nearby, a server hesitated mid-step, tray in hand, unsure whether to move closer or retreat, because the scene had stopped being casual and started becoming something else, something heavier. And then came the voices, softer now, less certain. A man near the bar leaned toward his companion, whispering, "That was unnecessary," while another guest shifted his stance, glancing between Ethan and the Whitmore family, calculating, always calculating, because in rooms like this, alliances could change faster than conversations. Daniel's mother, Victoria Whitmore, finally stepped forward, her heels clicking lightly against the polished floor, her smile composed, practiced, the kind that never fully reached her eyes. She placed a gentle hand on her son's arm, not to correct him, but to steady the narrative. "Daniel," she said lightly, though her tone carried an edge of control, "that is enough," but the word enough did not mean apology, it meant containment, it meant do not make this messy. She turned her attention to Ethan, her gaze sweeping over him in a way that felt more like assessment than acknowledgement. "I am sure this was a misunderstanding," she added, her voice smooth, measured. "These events can be confusing if you are not familiar with how they operate." The sentence landed with a softness that almost masked its intent, almost, because beneath it was the same message, refined, polished, but unmistakable: "You do not belong here," and for the first time, a faint reaction crossed Ethan's face, not anger, not offense, but recognition, as if he had heard this line before, in different rooms, from different people, dressed in different words, and still, he did not raise his voice, he did not argue, he simply held her gaze a second longer than expected, long enough for the silence to stretch again, long enough for a few more people to notice that something about this man did not align with the role he had been assigned, and somewhere in that growing awareness, the balance of the room began to shift, not dramatically, not yet, but enough to make the laughter from moments ago feel distant, like something that no longer fit the scene unfolding in front of them. The room did not return to normal, it tried to. Conversations restarted in fragments, glasses clinked again, someone near the back forced a laugh that did not quite land, but the energy had shifted in a way that could not be undone, because now people were watching more carefully, not just Ethan, but the Whitmores, measuring them, reassessing the moment they had just endorsed. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, his confidence no longer effortless, his fingers tightening around the stem of his glass as if he needed something solid to hold on to. "It was just a joke," he said, louder this time, not because anyone had asked, but because he needed the room to agree, needed the narrative to stay intact, and a few voices responded on instinct, light murmurs of agreement, the kind that came from habit rather than conviction, but they were weaker now, thinner. As if even those offering support were no longer certain it was deserved. Victoria Whitmore's smile remained in place, but her eyes flickered briefly across the room, reading the subtle changes, the hesitation, the distance growing between her family and the crowd. She adjusted her tone, softening it further. "We are all here to enjoy the evening," she said, directing her words outward now, not just at Ethan. "Let us not turn a small misunderstanding into something more than it needs to be." The phrase sounded reasonable, controlled, the kind of statement that usually ended tension, but it did not land the same way this time, because the moment had already become something more, and everyone could feel it. Ethan finally moved again, not abruptly, not defensively, but with intention. He reached for a linen napkin from a nearby table, folding it once in his hand before gently pressing it against the stain on his shirt, not to erase it, but to contain it, as if acknowledging its presence without giving it power. And then he set the napkin down, his movements precise, deliberate, the kind that drew attention without asking for it. His gaze lifted again, moving past Daniel now, past Victoria, scanning the room slowly, not searching for approval, but taking inventory. And that was when something changed in the way people looked back at him, because for the first time, it felt like he was the one assessing them, not the other way around, a man near the center of the room. An older investor with decades of experience behind his quiet posture, leaned slightly toward another guest and murmured, "Do you know who that is?" The question was not answered, but it lingered, spreading quietly, a seed of doubt planted in a room that had been so certain just moments ago. Daniel heard the shift even if he did not understand it, his jaw tightening as he forced a short laugh. "You are really milking this, man," he said, though the edge in his voice betrayed him, because now he was reacting. Now he was chasing control instead of holding it, and that inversion, subtle as it was, did not go unnoticed. Ethan's eyes returned to him, steady, unhurried, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, carrying just enough to reach those closest without needing to rise above the room. "You think this is about the shirt," he said, and for a brief second, the words seemed simple, almost understated, but they landed with a weight that pressed into the silence around them. Because everyone knew it was not about the shirt, not anymore, maybe it never was, and in that realization, the distance between what had happened and what it meant became impossible to ignore. Somewhere behind the crowd, A phone screen lit up as someone quietly searched a name they had just overheard. Another guest straightened, suddenly more attentive, as if sensing that the moment they were witnessing was no longer trivial, no longer safe, and in the center of it all, Ethan Cole Carter stood exactly where he had been, unchanged in posture, unchanged in tone, but now, undeniably, at the center of the room's attention in a way no one could dismiss or laugh away. The silence that followed did not feel empty, it felt loaded, like the moment before a verdict is spoken, and Daniel Whitmore sensed it slipping, not in a dramatic collapse, but in small, unsettling shifts, the kind that erode confidence from the inside out. He let out another laugh, louder this time, sharper, as if volume alone could restore control. "No, it is exactly about the shirt," he said, stepping half a pace closer, lifting his glass again with a careless tilt. "You walked in here looking like that and expected what? Respect?" The words drew a few scattered chuckles, but they did not echo the way they had before. They landed and stayed there, exposed, without the cushion of full agreement, and that difference was enough to make his next move feel less like dominance and more like insistence. Victoria Whitmore noticed it too, her posture tightening ever so slightly, her hand returning to her son's arm. This time with more pressure. "Daniel," she said again, quieter, but firmer. A warning beneath the elegance, but he brushed it off with a subtle shift, unwilling to retreat. "Not now, not in front of a room that had just begun to question him. Come on," he continued, gesturing loosely toward Ethan, "you show up to a $500 million investor gala dressed like you are grabbing coffee on a Saturday morning, and you expect people to take you seriously." This time, the room did not respond immediately, because the number, $500 million, hung in the air differently than the insult. It introduced something else into the conversation, stakes, and for a few people, recognition. A woman near the back glanced down at her phone again, her eyes narrowing as she scrolled, then widening just slightly, her gaze snapping back toward Ethan with a new intensity, while across the room, the older investor who had spoken earlier straightened fully now, his attention no longer casual, but focused, calculating in a different way. Daniel misread the silence, mistaking it for hesitation instead of doubt, and pushed further, lifting his glass once more as if to underline his point, letting a few more drops fall deliberately onto the already stained fabric. "There," he said with a smirk that did not quite hold, "now it matches better." But the reaction he expected did not come, no laughter, no easy approval, just a tightening of the air, a collective pause that stretched longer than it should have, because now the line had been crossed again, not just once, but twice, and repetition had turned the act from careless to intentional, and intention was harder to excuse. Ethan did not step back, did not raise his voice, did not even look down this time. His eyes remained fixed on Daniel, steady, unblinking, and in that stillness, something shifted again, something deeper, because now it was clear he was not absorbing the moment, he was letting it unfold, allowing every word, every action to settle into the room like evidence, and people felt that. Even if they could not name it. Victoria's composure cracked just enough for concern to show through, her eyes flicking once more across the crowd, noticing the phones, the whispers, the subtle distancing, and for the first time, she stepped slightly in front of her son, not to defend him, but to manage what was quickly becoming unmanageable. "I think we have entertained this long enough," she said, her tone shifting from polite to decisive. "If you are not a registered guest, I will have security escort you out." The sentence was delivered cleanly, efficiently, the kind of solution that usually restored order, but this time, it landed into a room that was no longer aligned, no longer certain, and as the word security settled into the silence, a quiet ripple moved through the crowd, not of agreement, but of anticipation, because something about this moment felt unfinished, like a door had just been pushed open, and no one yet knew what was waiting on the other side. And in the center of it all, Ethan Cole Carter remained exactly where he stood, unshaken, as if the idea of being removed from the room did not concern him at all, as if he understood something no one else had fully grasped yet, and that understanding, quiet and controlled, began to carry more weight than anything that had been said so far. The word security did not move Ethan, but it moved the room, not in action, but in awareness, because now the situation had crossed from social discomfort into something official, something that carried consequences, and people leaned in without meaning to, drawn by the tension that no longer pretended to be polite. A man near the entrance subtly stepped aside, clearing a path as if expecting someone to walk through it. while another guest lowered his voice mid-conversation, abandoning whatever topic had existed before this moment took over. Victoria Whitmore held her posture firm, her chin slightly raised, projecting control even as the atmosphere resisted it, because control in a room like this was not declared, it was felt, and hers was beginning to slip. Daniel, however, misread the shift again, mistaking the silence for submission. "Yeah," he added quickly, stepping half a pace forward as if to reclaim the center, "that is probably the best option." His tone carried forced confidence, the kind that tried to sound final but landed uncertain, and for a brief second, he glanced around, searching for reinforcement, but the faces he met were no longer aligned with him. Some looked away, others watched too closely, and a few, just a few, had begun to look at Ethan with something new, not curiosity, not pity, but recognition, faint and forming, like a memory trying to surface. Across the room, a phone buzzed quietly in someone's hand, the screen glowing with search results that confirmed what suspicion had started to whisper: a name, a face, a title, and the weight of it began to spread without a single word being spoken. Ethan finally moved again, not toward the exit, not toward the Whitmores, but slightly to the side, repositioning himself with calm precision, as if aligning with something unseen, his presence steady, unhurried, and when he spoke, his voice carried just enough to cut through the room without rising above it. "You think this ends with me leaving," he said, the statement simple, almost conversational, but it settled heavily into the space between them. Daniel let out a short laugh, quick and defensive. "That is usually how it works," he replied, but the edge in his voice was sharper now, thinner, like something stretched too tight. Victoria did not laugh. Her eyes fixed on Ethan with a new focus, reading, recalculating. Because something about his tone did not match the outcome she had just declared, and that mismatch created doubt, subtle but undeniable. Near the back, the older investor stepped forward just enough to be seen, his expression no longer neutral, his attention fully engaged, and when he spoke, it was quiet, but it carried. "I think we should let him finish." The interruption was not loud, not forceful, but it changed everything, because now the room had permission to pause, to reconsider, and that pause gave Ethan space, not just physically, but socially, the kind of space that shifted dynamics without needing to announce it. Daniel's jaw tightened, his control slipping further. "There is nothing to finish," he said, but fewer people believed him now, fewer people responded, and the silence that followed his words felt heavier than before, because it no longer supported him, it questioned him. Ethan's gaze moved briefly toward the older investor, acknowledging the shift without gratitude, without performance, just recognition, and then back to the Whitmores, steady, composed. "You called security," he continued, his tone unchanged, as if removing me would fix what just happened. The sentence landed differently than anything before it, not as a reaction, but as a statement of fact, and facts had a way of reshaping rooms like this, because they did not ask for agreement, they simply existed. Victoria's composure held, but only just, her voice lower now, more measured. "If you are not authorized to be here, then yes," she replied, but the certainty in her words no longer carried the same weight, because authorization, like everything else in that room, was beginning to feel less clear than it had moments ago, and in that growing uncertainty, the balance continued to shift, slowly, quietly, but undeniably, away from the people who had started this moment, and toward the man who had yet to raise his voice, yet to defend himself, yet somehow had begun to control everything around him without appearing to try at all. The mention of authorization lingered in the air like a question no one was ready to answer, and for the first time, it was not Ethan who seemed out of place, it was the certainty that had once filled the room, now thinning with every passing second, a subtle tension pulling at the edges of conversations that had long since stopped pretending to continue. Near the entrance, 2 security staff appeared, not rushing, not aggressive, but present, their dark suits blending into the elegance of the event, yet unmistakable in purpose. They paused just inside the doorway, scanning the room, waiting for a signal, and that pause mattered, because it showed hesitation, not command. Victoria Whitmore noticed them immediately, her posture straightening just a fraction more as she lifted her hand slightly, a controlled gesture meant to direct the situation back into order, but before she could speak, a voice cut in, not loud, not forceful, but clear enough to interrupt the momentum she was trying to build. "Hold on." It came from the same older investor, now fully stepped into view, his presence carrying a different kind of authority, one built over decades rather than inherited in a moment. All eyes shifted toward him, not because he demanded attention, but because he had earned it long before this night. He looked from Victoria to Daniel, then finally to Ethan, his gaze steady, analytical, as if assembling pieces that were finally starting to align, before anyone gets escorted anywhere. He continued, his tone calm but deliberate, I think we need to be very sure about who we are asking to leave. The sentence landed with precision, not as a challenge, but as a warning wrapped in reason, and it rippled through the room instantly, because now the question was no longer whether Ethan belonged, but whether anyone had been wrong about him. Daniel let out a sharp exhale, his patience thinning. This is ridiculous, he said, running a hand through his hair, the confidence that once defined his movements now replaced with something tighter, less controlled. We all saw what happened. He is not supposed to be here. But even as he spoke, his voice carried less conviction. Because the room was no longer echoing him, it was evaluating him. Victoria stepped forward again, her tone shifting slightly, less dismissive now, more cautious. If there has been any confusion, we can resolve it quietly, she said, her words carefully chosen, no longer pushing for removal, but for control, damage control, because she could feel it now, the shift, the risk, the possibility that this moment was no longer contained. Ethan watched it all unfold without interruption, his expression unchanged, but his eyes sharper now, more focused, as if the pieces had finally reached the point he had been waiting for. And then, without raising his voice, without stepping forward, he spoke again. There is no confusion, he said, the words simple, direct, and final, and something about the way he said them cut through every remaining layer of assumption in the room. The security staff near the door did not move, not forward, not back, they simply waited, their attention now split, uncertain which side of the room held the authority they were supposed to follow, and that uncertainty spoke louder than any command could have. A woman near the center lowered her phone slowly, her expression shifting from curiosity to realization, while another guest took a small step back, creating distance not from Ethan, but from the Whitmores, as if instinctively repositioning themselves before something irreversible happened. Daniel noticed it too, the space widening around him, the subtle retreat. And for the first time, his confidence cracked in a way that could not be hidden, his voice sharper now, almost defensive. Then explain it, he said, the words landing harder than he intended, because they revealed what he had been trying to avoid, uncertainty. And in that moment, the entire room seemed to lean in, not physically, but mentally, waiting, watching, because whatever came next was no longer about a spilled drink or a misplaced guest. It was about to redefine everything that had just happened, and at the center of it all, Ethan Cole Carter stood still, composed, as if he had been waiting for that exact question to be asked. The question did not echo, it settled, heavy and deliberate, and for a moment no one moved, not Daniel, not Victoria, not even the security staff by the door, because whatever answer came next carried more than explanation, it carried consequence. Ethan Cole Carter did not rush to fill the silence, he let it breathe, let it stretch just enough for the weight of the moment to sink into every corner of the room. His gaze steady, moving once across the faces watching him, not searching for approval, but recognizing awareness as it formed, and then he spoke, his voice calm, measured, impossible to ignore without being loud. You want an explanation, he said, his eyes returning to Daniel, holding there. Start with this. He paused, not for effect, but because the truth did not need urgency, it needed clarity. The $500 million deal your family has been negotiating for the past 6 months. The number landed differently now, sharper, more precise, pulling the attention of every investor, every executive, every observer who understood exactly what that figure meant. Daniel's expression flickered, just for a second, recognition cutting through his frustration, but he masked it quickly. What about it, he said, though his tone had already begun to shift, less certain, more guarded. Ethan did not look away. It does not exist without me, he replied, the sentence quiet, direct, and absolute, and for a brief moment, it felt like the room forgot how to react, because the words did not fit the image they had already accepted. They did not align with the assumptions that had guided every action up to this point. Victoria's composure faltered, not visibly to everyone, but enough for those paying attention, her eyes narrowing slightly as she recalculated. That is a bold claim, she said, her voice controlled, but no longer dismissive. Because something in his tone did not sound like a bluff, it sounded like fact. Across the room, the older investor exhaled slowly, almost inaudible, as if confirming something he had already suspected, while the woman with the phone lowered it completely now, her screen still lit with information she had just read, her gaze fixed on Ethan with a certainty that had not been there before. Daniel forced a laugh, but it came out thinner than intended. "You are telling me you are part of that deal," he said, shaking his head slightly. "That is not how any of this works." But even as he spoke, his eyes betrayed him, flicking briefly toward his mother, searching for reassurance, for grounding. Victoria did not give it, not immediately, because she was thinking now, moving through possibilities faster than she let on. Ethan let the silence return for a fraction of a second. Just enough for doubt to take hold where certainty once lived, and then he continued, "I am not part of it," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. "I am the one who signs it." The words landed like a shift in gravity, not explosive, not loud, but undeniable, and this time, the room reacted, not with noise, but with stillness, the kind that follows realization, because now the pieces aligned in ways that could not be ignored. The confidence, the calm, the refusal to react, it all made sense in a way it had not before. Daniel's expression changed, the certainty gone, replaced with something closer to disbelief. "That is not possible," he said, but the conviction was gone, replaced by something else, something fragile. Victoria took a small step forward, her voice lower now, careful, precise. "Who exactly are you?" she asked, and for the first time, the question did not carry arrogance, it carried necessity. Because the answer was no longer optional, it was critical, and in that moment, every person in the room understood that whatever name came next would not just explain the situation, it would redefine it completely, and Ethan Cole Carter stood there, composed, unshaken, ready to give them the answer they had not known they needed until it was too late. For a brief second, no one spoke, because the question had shifted everything. It was no longer about presence, or appearance, or even the insult that started it all. It was about identity, power, and the realization that the room may have made a mistake it could not easily undo. Ethan Cole Carter did not rush to answer. He let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of that realization to settle deeper into every person watching, his eyes steady, his posture unchanged, as if he had already lived this moment before, just in different rooms, with different faces. And then, quietly, without raising his voice, he said, "My name is Ethan Cole Carter." The words were simple, almost understated, but they did not land as ordinary, because now they carried context, they carried consequence, and across the room, something shifted instantly. The woman who had been searching earlier inhaled sharply, her hand tightening around her phone as if confirming what she had just read. The older investor closed his eyes for half a second, not in disbelief, but in recognition, as if a final piece had clicked into place. Daniel shook his head almost immediately, rejecting it before he could process it. "That does not mean anything," he said quickly, too quickly, his voice rising just enough to reveal the strain beneath it. "You expect us to believe that name changes anything here." But even as he spoke, fewer people were listening to him now. Their attention pulled toward Ethan in a way that felt irreversible. Victoria did not interrupt this time, her silence more telling than any response, her mind moving, recalculating, because she knew the name, not fully at first, but enough to feel its weight, enough to understand that this situation had just crossed into territory she could not control with tone alone. Ethan's gaze remained calm as he continued. "It should," he said, "not as a threat, not as a demand, but as a statement of fact." And that difference mattered, because facts did not need to convince, they only needed to be recognized. A man near the back took a slow step forward, his voice low but clear. "Carter Holdings," he said, almost to himself, but loud enough for those nearby to hear, and that was the moment the recognition spread, not all at once, but in waves, quiet murmurs, subtle shifts in posture, glances exchanged between people who suddenly understood the scale of what they were witnessing. Because Carter Holdings was not a small name, it was a force behind multiple billion-dollar deals, including the one the Whitmore family had spent months trying to secure. Daniel's expression tightened, the denial still there, but now mixed with something else, something closer to fear. "No," he said, shaking his head again, but this time slower, less certain. "That is not possible." Victoria finally stepped forward again, but her tone had changed completely, the confidence softened into caution. "The Control into calculation, Ethan Carter, she repeated carefully, as if testing the name, measuring it against everything she knew, everything she had assumed, and finding the two no longer aligned. Ethan did not move, did not react to the shift, he simply watched as the realization unfolded around him, because he did not need to push it, it was already happening. The security staff by the door remained still, their attention now fully fixed on him, no longer waiting for instructions, but waiting for clarity, because the authority in the room had changed without anyone announcing it, and everyone could feel it. The laughter from earlier was gone, replaced by a silence that felt heavier, more aware, and in that silence, the truth stood clear, not shouted, not forced, but undeniable. The man they had dismissed, mocked, and tried to remove was not just a guest. He was the one holding the power they had been negotiating for all along, and now, every second that passed without a response only made that realization more irreversible. The name did not need to be repeated, it had already done its work, it had already moved through the room like a quiet current, shifting positions, altering expressions, rewriting assumptions in real time, and Ethan Cole Carter could see it in their faces. The moment recognition replaced judgment, the moment power rebalanced itself without a single command being given, but instead of pressing forward, instead of capitalizing on the shift immediately, he paused, and in that pause, something deeper surfaced, not in the room, but within him, a memory, sharp and familiar, not distant, not faded, but present, like it had been waiting just beneath the surface. He was 24 again, standing in a glass office overlooking downtown Chicago, the skyline stretching behind him like a promise he had not yet been allowed to claim. His suit was new then, not expensive, but carefully chosen, every detail considered, every effort made to match the image expected of him, and still, the man across the table had barely looked at him, had glanced once, then twice, then set the file down with a dismissive breath. "We are looking for someone with a different profile." The words had been polite, professional, but the meaning had been clear. It was never about the numbers, never about the proposal, never about the vision he had spent months building. It was about him, about what he represented in a space that had already decided what success should look like. Ethan had walked out of that office that day without raising his voice, without arguing, without asking for reconsideration, but he remembered the feeling, not anger, not even disappointment, but clarity, the kind that cuts through doubt and leaves only direction. He remembered standing on the sidewalk afterward, watching the reflection of that same glass building in the window across the street, and making a decision that would shape everything that followed. He would not chase acceptance, he would build something that made acceptance irrelevant. And now, years later, standing in a room filled with the same kind of polished doubt, the same quiet assumptions dressed as standards, he felt that same clarity again, not as a reaction, but as a confirmation, because nothing about this moment was new. Only the scale had changed. The room came back into focus slowly, the present reclaiming its place, the faces, the silence, the weight of realization settling deeper with every second. Daniel's voice broke through it, but it lacked the force it once carried. "This does not change what happened," he said, but the words sounded smaller now, as if even he did not fully believe them anymore. Victoria remained still, her eyes fixed on Ethan, not with dismissal, but with calculation, because she understood something her son did not yet grasp. This was no longer a social misstep, it was a business consequence waiting to unfold. Ethan's gaze moved between them once more, steady, composed, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the same calm it always had, but now it held something more, something final. "You are right," he said, addressing Daniel directly. "It does not change what happened." The agreement landed unexpectedly, creating a brief pause, a moment of confusion, because it was not the response anyone had anticipated. But then he continued, his tone unchanged, "It defines what happens next," and that was when the weight of the moment fully settled, not just on the Whitmores, but on everyone watching, because now it was clear, this was not about correcting a mistake, it was about facing the outcome of it. And in that realization, the room grew even quieter, if that was possible, as if every person present understood that whatever came next would not just end the situation, it would set the tone for everything that followed. And Ethan Cole Carter, still standing in the same place, still wearing the stain they had tried to reduce him to, now held the power to decide exactly how that outcome would unfold. No one interrupted him this time, no one tried to redirect the moment or soften its edges. because the room had already crossed into a place where control no longer came from volume or status, it came from truth, and Ethan Cole Carter held it without needing to raise his voice. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket slowly, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with intention. And that single movement drew every eye in the room, because now they understood that whatever came next would not be symbolic, it would be decisive. His phone appeared in his hand, sleek, understated, nothing flashy, nothing designed to impress, and yet in that moment, it carried more weight than anything else in the room. Daniel watched it with a tightening jaw, his earlier confidence now replaced by something he could not quite mask, a flicker of uncertainty that grew with every second Ethan did not speak. Victoria's gaze followed the movement as well, her posture still composed, but her attention sharpened to a point, because she understood the language of power when she saw it, and this was it, quiet, controlled, irreversible. Ethan glanced down at the screen for only a moment, as if confirming something already decided, and then he lifted it to his ear, the room so silent now that even the soft tap of his finger against the device seemed amplified. "Carla," he said, his voice calm, precise, and immediate, no greeting, no explanation, just the name, and on the other end, the response came without delay, unheard by most, but felt through the way Ethan continued. "Cancel the Whitmore deal," he said, each word clear, deliberate, leaving no space for interpretation, and for a second, it felt like the room itself stopped breathing, not because of the volume of his voice, but because of the simplicity of the command, the way something so massive could be undone with so little effort. Daniel's expression shifted instantly, disbelief cutting through whatever control he had left. "You cannot be serious," he said, stepping forward now, the first real break in his composure, his voice louder than before, edged with panic he could not fully hide. "That is $500 million, but the number did not hold the same power anymore, not here, not in this moment, because the person who controlled it had already made his decision." Ethan did not lower the phone, did not rush to respond, he listened for a brief second, then added, effective immediately, and that was it. No raised voice, no dramatic gesture, just finality. He ended the call with a soft motion of his thumb, and the silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before, because now it was not anticipation, it was impact. Victoria took a step forward, her composure finally showing cracks, not in panic, but in urgency. "Ethan," she said, her tone shifting completely, stripped of the earlier condescension, replaced with something far more controlled, far more careful, "I think we should discuss this." But even as she spoke, she knew, the moment for discussion had already passed, the decision had been made before the call was even placed. Daniel shook his head, running a hand through his hair again, his voice unsteady now. "You cannot just cancel something like that over a misunderstanding." But the word misunderstanding sounded hollow, fragile, unable to carry the weight he needed it to. Ethan finally lowered the phone, his gaze steady as it returned to them, and when he spoke, his voice was the same as it had always been, calm, measured, unshaken. "It was not a misunderstanding," he said, and the words settled with quiet precision. "It was a decision," and in that moment, everyone in the room understood exactly what he meant, because they had all seen it unfold, they had all watched the choices that led here, and now, standing in the silence that followed, the Whitmores were no longer the center of power they had walked in as, they were the ones reacting, the ones trying to recover, while the man they had dismissed had already moved on. Already closed the door on something they could not reopen, and Ethan Cole Carter stood there, unchanged, the stain still visible on his shirt, but now it no longer looked like a mark of humiliation, it looked like the final detail in a moment that had shifted everything. The silence did not break immediately, it settled deeper, heavier, like the room itself was adjusting to a new reality it had not prepared for. Conversations that once filled the space were gone, replaced by quiet calculations happening behind composed expressions, because everyone there understood what $500 million disappearing in a single phone call actually meant, not just financially, but socially, strategically, reputationally, and for the Whitmore family. It was not just a loss, it was exposure. Daniel stood frozen for a moment, his earlier arrogance completely stripped away, replaced by something raw and unfamiliar. He opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again, the words no longer coming as easily as they had before, his eyes flicking toward his parents, searching for direction, for correction, for anything that could undo what had just happened. but there was nothing. Victoria Whitmore stepped forward once more, but this time, the shift was undeniable. Her posture still upright, but her tone measured with care. "Rather than control, Ethan," she said, her voice steady but softer now, "there is no need to make a permanent decision based on a moment that clearly escalated." The phrasing was deliberate, crafted to regain footing, to reframe the narrative, but even she knew it was fragile, because the room had seen everything, heard everything, and more importantly, understood everything. Ethan did not interrupt her, did not dismiss her. He simply listened, his expression unchanged, and that composure made her words feel smaller, less effective. Daniel stepped in quickly, his voice more urgent now, the edge of panic no longer hidden. "Look, if this is about what I said, then fine, I went too far," he said, the admission forced, uneven, as if he were negotiating rather than apologizing. "But you cannot throw away something this big over that," and the way he said that revealed everything, because even now, he was not addressing what had happened, he was addressing what it cost him. A few people in the room exchanged glances, subtle but telling, the kind that marked a shift in perception, because now they were not just witnessing power, they were witnessing character. Ethan finally moved, just slightly, turning his body to face them more directly, not aggressively, not confrontationally, but with clarity, his gaze moving from Daniel to Victoria, and then across the room, acknowledging the audience that had become part of this moment whether they intended to or not. "You think this is about what you said," he began, his voice calm, steady, cutting through the silence without needing force. "It is not." The words landed clean, precise, and the distinction mattered, because it shifted the entire foundation of the conversation. Daniel frowned slightly, confusion mixing with frustration. "Then what is it about?" he asked, his tone less certain now, because he could feel the answer would not be something he could easily dismiss. Ethan held his gaze, unshaken. "It is about what you believed," he said, and that sentence changed everything, because it reached beyond the moment, beyond the action, into the assumption that had driven it. The room absorbed it in silence, because everyone there understood exactly what he meant, the judgment, the dismissal, the certainty that someone like him did not belong in a room like this. Victoria's expression tightened, not in anger, but in realization, because she saw it now, the pattern, the mistake, not just in action, but in perception, and more importantly, she saw how it had cost them. Ethan continued, not louder, not harsher, just clearer. "You did not question me because of what I did," he said, "you questioned me because of who you thought I was," and in that moment, there was no defense left that could hold, no explanation that could soften it, because it was not an accusation, it was a reflection, one that everyone in the room could see for themselves, and as that truth settled in, the balance of the room shifted completely, not just in power, but in respect, because now it was clear, this was never about a mistake that could be corrected, it was about a mindset that had already revealed itself, and in Ethan Cole Carter's world, that was something no deal, no number, no negotiation could justify keeping. No one spoke immediately after his words settled, because there was nothing left to challenge, nothing left to reframe. The truth had already taken its place in the center of the room, and now it was doing what truth always did, it forced everyone to confront themselves, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, internally, and that kind of confrontation was far more powerful than any argument. Victoria Whitmore exhaled slowly, the control she had carried throughout the evening now shifting into something more deliberate, more measured. She took a step closer, not as someone reclaiming authority, but as someone acknowledging its absence. "Ethan," she said, her voice lower now, stripped of pretense, "we misjudged the situation." The admission was careful, precise, but it was not enough, not here, not after everything that had unfolded, because this was no longer about a situation, it was about a pattern. Daniel stood beside her, silent now, his earlier defiance gone, replaced by a realization he could not fully process yet, his gaze fixed on the floor for a moment, before lifting again, but without the same certainty he had carried before. Around them, the room had changed completely. The same people who had laughed earlier now stood still, watching, not as spectators, but as witnesses to something that had gone beyond social misstep and into consequence. A few guests shifted subtly, creating space, not for Ethan to leave, but for him to stand alone at the center. A quiet acknowledgement of where authority now rested. The older investor nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if confirming that the outcome unfolding was not only justified, but necessary. Ethan did not move to close the distance between them, he did not reach for resolution, because resolution had already been decided the moment he made that call. Instead, he stood exactly where he was, composed, grounded, his presence unchanged despite everything that had shifted around him, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the same calm it always had, but now it held something final. Something that left no room for negotiation. It was never about the deal, he said, his eyes moving briefly across the room, acknowledging the people who had watched, who had remained silent, who had chosen sides without speaking. Deals can be rebuilt, he continued, reputation can recover. He paused for just a fraction of a second, not for effect, but because what came next did not need to be rushed. But character shows itself in moments like this. The words settled deeper than anything. Before them, because they did not accuse, they revealed, and that distinction made them impossible to dismiss. Victoria's expression tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in acceptance, because she understood what he was saying, understood that this was no longer about salvaging a partnership, it was about facing what had already been exposed. Daniel shifted his weight again, the discomfort clear now, not from the loss of the deal alone, but from the realization that the room had seen him differently than he had seen himself, and that image could not be undone, not tonight, not easily. Across the space, a few quiet murmurs began, not of gossip, but of reflection, people recalculating not just business positions, but personal ones, because moments like this did not stay contained, they carried forward, into future conversations, future decisions, future alliances. Ethan let the silence return once more, not as a pause, but as a conclusion, because there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to prove, everything that needed to be understood had already been shown, and in that stillness, the balance of the room settled into its new reality, one where power was no longer assumed, but recognized, and where the man who had been dismissed at the beginning of the night now stood as the only person who had never needed to prove he belonged at all. No one tried to stop him when he finally moved, because by then, everyone understood that nothing in that room could be undone by words, not apologies, not explanations, not even regret. Ethan Cole Carter adjusted his jacket slightly, the faint stain still visible but no longer defining, no longer the center of attention. Instead it had become something else entirely. A quiet reminder of the moment that revealed everything. He did not rush, did not look back immediately, he simply took a step forward, then another, his pace steady, controlled, as if the weight of what had just happened did not follow him, but stayed behind, embedded in the room, in the people, in the silence that lingered even after he began to leave. Daniel Whitmore stood frozen, watching him go, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and realization, because for the first time, he was not the one being watched. He was the one being remembered, not for his status, not for his wealth, but for the moment. He had misjudged someone who never needed his approval. Victoria Whitmore remained still, her posture composed, but her eyes tracking Ethan with a level of focus that spoke louder than any words she could have offered, because she understood now that what had been lost was not just a deal, it was leverage, position, and something far more difficult to recover, credibility. Around them, the room slowly began to breathe again, but not the same way it had before. Conversations restarted in low tones, cautious, measured, as if everyone was aware that they had just witnessed something that would carry beyond this night, beyond this room, into boardrooms and negotiations and quiet reputations that shaped entire industries. The older investor stepped aside slightly as Ethan approached, giving him space without needing to announce it. A subtle gesture of respect that had not been offered at the beginning of the night, and as Ethan passed, the man gave a small nod, not as acknowledgement of status, but of principle, and that distinction mattered. Near the entrance, the security staff straightened instinctively, no longer uncertain, no longer waiting for instruction. They stepped aside without a word, not because they had been told to, but because they recognized authority when it stood in front of them. Ethan reached the edge of the room before pausing, not to turn fully, not to reclaim the moment, but just enough to let his presence settle one last time into the space behind him. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, steady, carrying just far enough to be heard without breaking the quiet. "You did not lose the deal tonight," he said, and for a brief second, it sounded like a correction, something almost merciful, but then he continued, "You revealed why you never should have had it." The words landed with finality, not harsh, not loud, but absolute, and no one in the room could argue with them, because they had seen it, lived it, participated in it, whether through action or silence, and in that moment, the lesson was no longer abstract, it was real, immediate, and impossible to ignore. Ethan did not wait for a response, did not need one, he turned and walked out, the doors closing behind him with a quiet finality that felt louder than anything that had come before, and inside that room, no one laughed, no one spoke above a whisper, because the balance had shifted permanently, and the man they had once dismissed had left with something far more valuable than any deal. He had left with the truth, intact, undeniable, and now, carried by everyone who had witnessed it.